Chapter 17, Fears and Hopes. The attendant at the desk, a nurse in the 40s, ran through a list of names. Raymond Thorson, she said. Yes, you can see him today. Will you wait, please? Hilda took a seat. It was easy to be patient now. The child was able to leave his bed. He was out of danger. She was speculating as to how he looked. The 4.5 weeks at the hospital must have thinned him considerably. Would the scarlet rashes still show? How near would she be allowed to get to him? They were so strict with the isolation cases. A nurse took her around to the rear of the building. In the windows on the first and second floor, children were standing. In the yard below, their mothers were looking up to them, motioning, talking. The nurse pointed to 2 windows on the first floor. In a few minutes, little Raymond appeared in one of them. The bathrobe and slippers he wore were too large for him. He put his hands against the glass window as if to prop himself and stood peering into the yard. He apparently did not recognize his mother at once. Hilda saw him as if through a mist. Raymond's light, wavy hair had been cut off, and this, together with the effects of his sickness, seemed to have reduced his face to half its former proportions. His ears stood out sharp and big. His neck had become thin and sallow. She was talking to him, asking him how he felt, but her voice did not carry. The child looked puzzled. He began to mumble something, his face quivered, and he burst into tears. She had brought some toys with her, a rubber balloon and other things, and she showed them to him, motioning that she would have them brought to him soon. The child brightened up and smiled. She had intended to stay at least half an hour in front of the window and look at him. Look. She was seeing him for the first time since his illness. But little Raymond was holding himself on his thin, weak legs with difficulty, and taking a last long look at her son. Hilda threw a kiss at him and ran before the child fully realized that she was going away. In the office, she was told that her boy would not be released for 2.5 or 3 weeks yet. They took no chances with scarlet fever cases. The nurse who took the toys from her for the child advised her that she had better calculate on 3 weeks. It would take fully that long before he would be entirely well. Even 3 weeks, Hilda figured, would bring the child home almost a week before his birthday, his 5th birthday. All the way home, she was planning little Raymond's birthday party, the surprises she would make him. She was glad summer was ahead. He would recuperate quickly. She would see that he did. She would take him to the park every evening and along the Hudson. She would take him on the bus. He liked bus rides. His hair would grow out, and he would have the same beautiful head again. Yes, he would. Her child, her all. She cried and laughed by turns. Hilda was sharing a 4-room apartment with a middle-aged woman who worked as a proofreader, and the latter's daughter, a schoolgirl of 15. The experiment of running a cooperative apartment with Miss Evans and the other girls had come to an end nearly 2 years earlier, and only a short time after Miss Heath had left for Denver to be married. Many things had happened in those 2 years. Much had been changed. Hilda was still with the shop safety committee, but instead of climbing stairs and inspecting factories, she was working inside. She was in charge of the office now. Of the other young women with whom she had started work, only 1 or 2 still clung to their jobs. The rest had left the committee. Miss Evans had accepted a place with the woman suffrage party. She was organizer at first and now had become one of the big leaders of the movement. She made speeches and figured in the newspapers frequently. Harriet Adams was peeved that that job of organizer had been offered to Miss Evans and not to herself. They were both equally active for suffrage and withdrew entirely from politics, as she put it. She resigned her job with the Safety Committee and turned her attention once more to writing. After a brief trial in that direction, however, she discovered that what she was really interested in was psychoanalysis and turned to that. Thereafter, Hilda saw her rarely. Florence Meade, their California friend, had entered into a free love union with an illustrator some 3 or 4 years younger than herself. They told their friends that they were very happy. A child came, but died 3 days after it was born. Miss Meade did not cease talking about the child. Her artist husband claimed he was heartbroken over the death of the little one. Nevertheless, at the end of 6 weeks, when Florence was quite well again, she took separate living quarters. Shortly after that, she parted from her artist husband entirely and went back to California. Hilda had during that time been offered a number of positions. 2 overtures came from international unions, big labor organizations, who wanted her to be organizer for them. She turned these jobs down. They would take her away from her child evenings. Also, these jobs would require her to make speeches, and she had a secret dread of stepping upon a platform and standing up before a crowd. With the breaking up of the cooperative apartment, there was an end to the talk fests, as the frequent gatherings in the house came to be known. But Hilda was not without friends. Many of her woman acquaintances were in the habit of looking in on her when they wanted a sensible talk, as they put it. Several of the men, too, came up from time to time. Her new work required all the attention she could give it. Between tending to her job and looking after the child, Hilda's physical strength was taxed to the utmost. Nevertheless, there were times when her whole being ached for someone near. At such times, the thought of going on like this, of going through life alone, grieved her. Love, marriage, however, held so many possibilities for new complications, for pains, that she shunned the thought of them. Hilda felt as if she still had an open account with Raymond Everett. She would have to let the man who loved her know about her past, about Raymond. Also, she felt that if she married, Raymond should know of it, should know of their child. She would not want anything hidden from the one or from the other. One offer of marriage she had during this time. It came from Herbert Carston, the secretary of the Society for the Spreading of Manual Training among Colored Children. Although Carston visited Hilda frequently and talked with her on many subjects, he never talked of love, and his offer of marriage was made in a letter. Hilda read the letter, and as soon as she got to the office, she called Carston on the telephone. Could he come up to see her that evening? She could hear his voice sink as she was speaking to him. It was not thus a woman would speak to a man she loved. He came. She received him very cordially. They had been friends for a long time, she said, and for that reason she had asked him to come. She did not feel that she could put in writing what she wished to say. She appreciated his letter, but there could be no talk of marrying between them. It was not anything concerned with him that was responsible for this. It was her own life, her own previous love, her suffering. She could not enter into details. But this love and suffering of the past had not cleared away yet. It was still on her horizon. Karsten remained a long time with her that evening. He talked much about his work, the progress manual training was making among the colored people, the ripening of a new consciousness in the relations between the races. He talked as if he were trying to forget something. Hilda was sorry for him. She had received several visits from Hillstrom during the year following the breaking up of the cooperative apartment. Even the old popcorn party, which had been postponed again and again, had finally come off. For the past year, she and Hillstrom had been corresponding. She wrote to him whenever she was in doubt and wanted to consult with someone of like mind who would understand her. Hillstrom always answered her letters promptly. He wrote to her from whatever part of the country he happened to be in, telling her about the labor movement there, about the socialist situation. He had been arrested a number of times in the course of these 2 years in connection with strikes and was under indictment in several states. But he was not taking these things seriously, Hillstrom wrote. Arrest and indictment of leaders, he said, had come to be a regular feature of labor warfare in America. After the strikes were settled, these indictments were usually quashed, as they had no ground in law in the beginning. A pleasant interest came suddenly into Hilda's life. Willie Breen, her friend Ada's little Willie, began visiting her frequently. He would come on a Saturday night and would very often stay until the following evening. Sometimes he brought his violin with him, sometimes his school books. Willie was 14 years old. His grandmother had died. He was living with an aunt, a sister of his mother's, but was earning his own living. He worked in an office during the day. In the evening, he went to night high school. He confided to her some of his troubles. He had had to drop his music after his mother's death. And now, though he was working, he was still unable to resume it because the lessons came high. The advanced teachers demanded such high prices. However, he hoped to come back to his violin as soon as he should earn a little more. They would often sit up late and talk of old times. There was much Hilda could tell Willie about his mother, things his grandmother never knew, never understood. She described Ada Breen's fine traits, her courage, her idealism, her devotion to the memory of her husband. The boy never grew tired of listening to these stories of his mother. He was filled with pride and regretted that Hilda had not known his father as well. She would no doubt have had many things to tell of him, too. As it was, he knew so little of his father. His mother's people even answered his questions about Leon Breen grudgingly. One day, Willie brought a thick notebook with him. For about a year, he confided to Hilda, he had been writing verses. No one knew of it, not even his teachers. He was ashamed to tell them. Hilda listened to him earnestly and told him not to be ashamed and to go on writing his poems. Many great poets had begun to write at just such an age as his. With the parents he had had, she would not be at all surprised if he grew up to be a poet or a writer. Thereafter, the boy consulted with her about his work and plans regularly. Her every word had become law to him. He clung to her with tender devotion. He and little Raymond had come to be as brothers to one another. She had met a number of Chicago people. The fame of the Shop Safety Committee was spreading. Several articles had appeared about it in the magazines, and labor and social welfare organizations were sending representatives to New York to study its workings. All such visitors were turned over by the director of the committee, a Dr. Baum, to Hilda for details with regard to the management of the work. One of the Chicago visitors to the offices of the committee was a lawyer. He was the attorney for a big union and was of an age with Raymond Everett. What if Raymond should one day walk into her office? The thought came to her on her way to work one morning, and her heart began to beat faster. The more she reflected on this possibility, the more plausible it seemed. She conjured up Raymond's probable career. He had no doubt carried out his father's wish and had become a lawyer. It was equally plausible that he should be interested in the labor movement. He had given her the book on French and German socialism. He had evidently studied the labor movement in college. So many of the men she had been meeting, men who were figuring in the intellectual activities of the trade union movement, had begun their interest in labor problems in just that way. The thought that Raymond would one day walk in on her did not leave her for weeks. There were days when she would give an involuntary start every time the door of her office opened. She was making up her mind as to how she would act on meeting him. Would she tell him about the child? Would he ask? Well, whether he would ask or not, she would tell him. She would make it clear to him that the boy was hers, hers only. She was both mother and father to him. Raymond probably would not care. He no doubt was married and had other children by this time. She wondered whether his other children were nicer than little Raymond. They no doubt had better advantages, had been made welcome, had not suffered so much. After some weeks, the feeling of dread at the thought of meeting Raymond disappeared completely. In its place came a desire to meet him. Instead of fearing that he might come, she now began to hope that he would come. She would like to see him, arrive at a definite understanding with him, clear things once for all. Chicago would then be accessible to her once more. She could go there again. For some time now, Hilda had had a craving to go back to Chicago. She was weary of New York, as weary as her friend Ada had once been. Everybody she was coming in contact with appeared to be weary and wanting to escape it. New York, it seemed to her, was like a stage. One could stand the stage for so long, and then one needed a change. One needed to get away from the spotlight. She had been on this stage so many years. Besides, Chicago was so near Stillwell. She longed to be in Stillwell once more. If she ever got back to Chicago, she would go to Stillwell for a visit. She would go there in the summer, late when the corn is turning yellow. She was now praying for Raymond to come. Such a visit would set her free. She could go, move wherever she pleased. But Everett stayed away. He was not coming. In the meantime, it was July, the last days of July 1914. Rumblings of the Great War came.